Hello and welcome everyone to the second episode of our A to Z chess opening series. In today's episode, we are going to learn about the letter B. And from B, we are going to discuss about the bishop's opening. The most famous, the most common, the bishop's opening. So without wasting time, let's get started. Now this happens after the move e4, e5 and now white plays bishop c4. Instead of going for the Italian playing the knight to f3 or going for the Vienna knight c3, bishop c4 is a little less common but is also effective. It is a perfectly sound move as it develops a piece, also gives an attack to the weak f7 square. Now here black can respond in various ways. Black can either play the knight to f6, can play the knight to c6 or can go symmetrically by playing their bishop to c5. In this opening video, we are going to have a look at all these three lines in detail. How can white conquer this and get a winning position? We are going to have a look at all the tricks, traps and strategies in detail. So stay tuned till the end. Let's first start with what about he plays his bishop to c5, going for the symmetrical line. Here we are going to go for aggressively. We are going to go for pawn to d4. Now at first, pawn d4 looks like we are sacrificing a pawn. He is attacking it twice, we are defending it only once. Let's see what happens if he first captures it with the e pawn. If he captures it with the e pawn, then we are going to go bishop f7, capture the pawn back and give a check. The king captures the bishop. Now you can go queen h5, a double attack, attacking the king as well as the bishop. He blocks the check with his pawn. You can capture the bishop. The position is completely equal. The pieces are completely equal. But position is worsened for black. As he has moved his king, so he loses the right to castle. He cannot castle anymore. Also, your queen is active. You are giving an attack over here. So, you will have a good initiative here. You can give a good attack over here. Let's say if he continues it by defending the pawn on d4 by playing the knight to c6, we can put more pressure on the pawn by playing a knight to f3. Now if he gives an attack to a queen by playing the pawn to d6, then there are two choices that we can go. We can either go queen c4, give a check, or interesting is to play queen d5 and give a check. So after queen d5, there's a check. If he blocks the check with his bishop on e6, well, that's a disaster then, because you can now go knight g5, give a check and win the bishop on spot. So winning a piece, eventually winning the game. Okay, it's not necessary that he's gonna play that. He has to play those moves, but it is kind of natural. Those are the normal looking moves what black can do here. Okay, let's come back. What if he doesn't capture your pawn with his e-pawn? Instead, he captures the pawn with the bishop. Even if he captures with the bishop, we are going to go and attack the bishop by playing a knight to f3, also developing one of our minor pieces. After the bishop, now here if he plays normally, defending the bishop, playing his knight to c6, we can here simply castle. After he plays his knight to f6, you can capture the bishop. This is the right time to capture the bishop. We are actually waiting for the correct time when we can capture. After he captures it, and let's say if the pawn captures the knight, then you can push your pawn up. And look, suddenly knight has moved and has no good squares to go to. Now we can simply play our pawn to e5. Here, look at this knight. Suddenly, he has no good squares to go to. Also, we are giving an attack to him, right? If he captures a pawn on the e5 square, thinking that it's a free pawn, well, rook e1 just wins the knight on spot. The best way to take advantage of the pin is to give an attack to it with the pawn. Pawns are the best attackers as well as the best defenders as well. So, you are giving an attack to that knight using your pawn and the knight is pinned. He cannot move. You are going to win that knight eventually. Okay. What if let's see what if he doesn't capture it with the e-pawn, instead he simply captures it with the knight. When he captures on the d4 square with his knight, we can now first play f4, putting some more pressure on the e-pawn. If he captures, then the knight is lost. So he cannot capture and we are trying to control the center. If he now defends the center by playing his pawn to d6, then we can first capture over here. He captures back. Now look at this. The file for the rook is open and the diagonal for the bishop is also open. So what to do? Just go with the bishop to g5. Pin the knight to the queen. He cannot move the knight. We are already giving some pressure on the knight. And now next idea is to simply play this and put some more pressure along the pin. Okay, if he castles over here, you are going to go with knight c3. You can also develop the knight on the d2 square or maybe on the a3 square to keep your chances open to push this pawn on c3 and attack the knight. But knight c3 has a much more bigger motive here, is to go on d5 and take advantage of this. If he understands your plan is to go on the d5 square with your knight, and if he blocks it with bishop to e6, still go with the knight to d5. Now there are change in plans. If he captures it, you capture it back with the pawn, and suddenly the pawn from e4 is now on d5 and is looking good, right? Also, look at this knight. How is this knight supposed to go back? Right now, he currently is having no good squares to go in his own camp. The threat is play a pawn to c3. Where will the knight go? The knight will be lost eventually, right? If then he plays his queen to d6, trying to protect the knight with the idea to go queen c5 and give a attack to your c4 bishop, we are first going to capture the knight. Now change of plans. Capture the knight on the f6 square. Destruct his king side. He captures your bishop on the f6 square with the pawn. Now you can go with your bishop to d3. The idea is to give attack on h7 and then you're going to go with your queen to h5 and this will be a checkmate eventually. Let's see how he defends that. He captures your pawn. You go first, give an attack to the knight. The knight has to go back and then you win the queen. Bishop h7 check. The king captures the bishop and you win the queen on spot. So going back few 4 square. Now what can we do? So here first we give an attack to this knight and we are also aiming for this. Knight e4 will be a bad move there because you can play your queen to f3, give an attack to this knight. The knight has no good squares to go to, he cannot control this, he cannot control this, and you are eventually going to win the knight. So that is again a bad idea to do. So this was all about what happens when he places symmetrically, he places bishop to c5. Now coming back to the original position, the bishop's opening, after the symmetrical move, let's have a look at what happens when he places knight to c6. After he places knight to c6, we can delay the movement of this knight. Don't play the knight to f3 immediately because main idea in bishop's opening is to control the center. Go aggressively, and that can be done by pushing your pawn either to d4 or by playing your pawn to f4. So here idea can be to play the pawn to f4. Don't play knight immediately on the f3 square. Instead, you can go with the knight to c3 first. Now let's say he places knight to f6. You can first play your pawn to d3. Again, delaying the development of the knight because you want to push the pawn on f4 first. If he plays something like d6, now you go directly with f4. He capture, you can anytime capture it back with the bishop, right? If he plays his bishop to e7, you now go knight f3, he castle, you can castle as well. And now if he tries to pin your knight to the queen, that would be bad because then you are going to play pawn h3, give an attack to the bishop. If the bishop goes back, then this attack is obvious and then you're going to win this bishop eventually. And if he captures after h3, he captures your knight, then you can anytime capture it back with the queen. Double up your pieces along the f-file. If the queen is now attacked, that is just one move threat. We are not afraid about it because we are going to go with our queen to f2 and protect the c2 pawn as well. So it is so far so good for white, right? He played his queen to d7. We are playing our bishop to e3, trying to kick off that knight. And everything looks good for white here with a great initiative. Also, the files and the ranks are open for the rooks and the bishops to go. So it is overall a good position for white. Whenever you play bishop's opening, you are actually bringing out your opponent out of the theory. If he doesn't know how to continue for a long time, and because you know the idea, you have seen the video and I hope you are enjoying it. So you know how to continue and what to continue. It is actually very aggressive. Okay. So coming back to knight c6 move again. What after knight c6? We are going to go with a pawn to c3. Let's say he plays knight f6. And here, instead of moving the pawn to d6, he first goes with his bishop to c5. Here, if he plays his bishop to c5, we can still continue on the f4 square. That is not bad, but it is a little risky, I would say. Because now if you play a pawn to f4, there are chances that the knight can anytime jump in after d6, come on g4 and can create a lot of problems for white there. So a better idea is to not play the pawn to f4, but to do a different plan. Here we can go with a bishop to g5. Instead of playing pawn f4, you go g5. There was one more problem with f4, that what if he captures your knight? If he captures your knight on the g1 square, then you cannot castle anymore on the king side. The rook will have to capture, and you cannot capture it on the you cannot castle on the king side. So that's why a better choice is to go with the bishop to g5. Pin the knight to the queen. Now here if he castles, then we have a good idea. How to take advantage of a pin is to put some more pressure on it and go with your knight to d5. You are basically trying to destruct his pawn structure, but also putting some more pressure on this knight. You don't need to be afraid about this bishop g5 move actually, but yeah, it is good. Some people might be afraid and play their pawn to h6. We can simply capture and have a good position as white there. So this was all about the second line. What about he plays his knight to c6? Now let's have a look at the correct and the final line. What if black plays his knight to f6? After black plays his knight to f6, we are still going to go aggressively, sacrificing the pawn on the e4 square. We will be playing our pawn to d4. Now here there are two choices he can do. Either he can capture on the d4 square, or he can capture with the knight on the e4 variation. So when he captures on the e4 square with his knight, you can first capture on e5 with your pawn, and then the idea is to go queen d5, attack this knight, attack the pawn on the f7 square. When you have a pawn on e5, you are taking control of all these two squares where the knight could actually escape. You are also attacking this with a bishop. He's defending it with the queen, but you are attacking it. So you capture on the d5, e5 square with your d pawn. Now here if he plays his pawn to d6, then you can simply go queen d5, attack the knight, and you are going to win the knight because queen f7 is a threat there. Okay. What if he's not playing his pawn to d6, but he's playing his knight to c6? After knight c6, you can capture on the f7 square. The king captures it. Now queen d5 wins you the knight, and also you have destructed his king. That is, he has moved the king and he cannot castle anymore. So you win the position like that way. This was a shorter line where the knight captured on the e4 square. Now let's have a look what if the pawn captures on d4. After e takes on d4, we can play our knight to f3. Now we are not immediately capturing on the d4 square because we don't want to give a free tempo. We don't want him to win a tempo by playing his knight to c6 and attack our queen immediately. Now here, if he captures on the e4 square thinking that this is again a free pawn, then you win a tempo by attacking his knight. Now capture on the d4 square with your queen. The knight is in danger. There are two ways where the knight can go. Either the knight can go on f6 or he can go back on. What happens after he goes on f6? You can play normally, play the knight to c3. He attacks your queen and you can come back on the d3 square. Bishop c5 and bishop g5. Pin the knight. Knight d5 is your idea to take advantage of the pin. He castle and you can castle on the long side. I'm going to show you the continuation of this line further because that is interesting. There is also a cool tactical combination coming in your way that you can play as white there. So here after bishop g5 long castle, what if he plays his pawn to h6 attacking your bishop? So we don't need to worry about it. We just can capture the pawn on the h6 square with the bishop because after he captures your bishop, you have this queen g6 taking advantage along this pin. So the king goes on the h8 square and now you can play your queen to h. Now here after queen h6, when he blocks the check by playing his knight to h7, you can play your knight to e4. Now idea behind knight e4 is to play your knight to g5, putting one or the other knight on the g5 square. And also you are attacking the bishop on the c5 square. If he defends his bishop and goes on the e7 square with the bishop, then you can add one more defender and play your pawn to h4. If he plays his pawn to f6, trying to stop your knight on g5 doesn't matter to us. We are still going to go with the knight to g5. Any knight is fine on the g5 square. If he captured, now you capture back with the h pawn because now you open the file for this rook and this checkmate is unstoppable. He cannot defend this checkmate. So that is something that if he plays his pawn to h6, you can win. That was a cool tactical combination there. What if he's not playing his pawn to h6? Instead, he's going with his pawn to d6. The time he plays his pawn, so you are going to go with your knight to e4. Now, not d5 but e4, because you are taking advantage along this pin. Also, you are giving an attack to the bishop. Now, this is a great initiative for white, and white can win this game easily. If I were to choose a side, I would have definitely chosen white, because white looks the position looks completely good. Look at the rook. The rook came into the game immediately after the long castle lane. The files are open, the pieces are well placed, and everything is good for white here. So this was one line what we saw when the knight, after you attack the knight goes back on the f6 square. Now let's quickly have a look what if he places knight on the d6 square. So after he places knight to d6, he's taking a tempo by attacking our bishop, but we are not really afraid about that bishop, because now we can simply castle. The king is in the center, open, we castle so that we can give an attack along the e file. If he captures your bishop over here, you play rook e1, give a check. The bishop has to block it. Now you can simply capture on the g7 square, attack the rook. The only way to defend the rook is to go on the f8 square, and once he moves his rook to f8, now there are multiple ways you can win. Simple is to play bishop h6 and put some more pressure. This is game lost for black. He can do nothing about it. Even if he wants to save the checkmate, he has to play his pawn to d6, and eventually the rook will be lost. You are going to win the rook. This was all about the bishop's opening. I hope you enjoyed the video and got to learn new about this bishop's opening. If you will be trying this opening against your opponent, you will win many games with this. So if you like our video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.